The auditorium trembled with the sound of applause. It was 2025, the final round of the International Debate Championship. The air was charged with disbelief and pride as the moderator's voice rang out, announcing the champions, the team from the Philippines. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then came the eruption. Cheers, clapping, the echo of 1,000 hands breaking into thunder. Carlo stood at the center of the stage, 19 years old, his dark eyes glowing beneath the harsh lights. His voice, the one they had mocked only days before, had carried them here. Beside him, Maria adjusted her glasses, her smile trembling as she tried to hide the tear forming in the corner of her eye. Ben, quiet and steady, bowed his head and whispered a thank you, perhaps to the judges, perhaps to something greater. The same audience that had once laughed at their accents now stood to their feet. Cameras flashed. The noise swelled until it filled the entire hall. At the judges' table, an older man leaned toward the microphone, his voice shaking slightly, not from authority but from humility. Today, he said, I've learned something I should have known long ago. Intelligence cannot be measured by an accent. The voice of the Philippines, with all its rhythm, color, and history, reminds us that truth doesn't need permission to be powerful. A quiet settled after his words, the kind of silence that only follows revelation. Then the applause returned, louder, freer, unrestrained. In that sound was more than victory. It was vindication. For Carlo, Maria, and Ben, it was not just the end of a debate. It was the beginning of a story that had started long before the trophies, in a place far from the stage, in the echo of laughter that once tried to silence them. As the cheers faded into memory, a quiet question began to rise beneath the noise. Subtle yet insistent. How did they get here? How did three students from Quezon City, a place far from the marble halls of Europe and the ivy walls of America, come to stand on the world stage and silence a room that once mocked them? The applause still echoed, but behind it lay the weight of a long journey, one marked by ridicule, long nights, and the stubborn refusal to stay silent. Their triumph was not born from privilege or polish. It came from the ache of being underestimated, from the sting of laughter that cut deeper than any argument. Carlo's eyes, still bright under the stage lights, drifted for a moment toward the ceiling, as if searching for the first day the story began. Somewhere behind the shimmer of victory, he could still hear it, the laughter that started it all. It wasn't the friendly kind. The laughter had shape, tone, and judgment. It said you don't belong here. It said your voice doesn't matter. That sound had once filled the same kind of room, crowded with bright lights and sharper eyes. That was where their story truly began, not with applause, but with a smirk. Not with pride, but with humiliation. And it was from that single careless laugh that everything else would ignite. It began in a vast auditorium filled with polished accents and quiet arrogance. The competition gathered the brightest teams from universities across Europe and North America, confident, well-dressed, and certain of their superiority. At the back of the room, the Philippine team waited for their turn, holding nothing but their notes and a quiet determination that didn't yet have a name. When their moment came, Carlo stepped forward. His shirt was crisp, his hands steady. He lifted the microphone and greeted the panel with practiced poise. "Good morning, honorable panel, ladies and gentlemen." The words were clear, formal, correct. Yet before he could continue, a voice from the second row whispered to a teammate, just loud enough to be heard, "Sounds like karaoke night." A ripple of laughter followed, small at first, then spreading, a current of mockery disguised as amusement. Maria's fingers tightened around her note cards. Ben's gaze dropped to the floor, his throat locked. None of them spoke, but they all heard it, the dismissal hidden behind every snicker. They were not mocked for what they said, but for how they sounded. The Filipino cadence, warm and melodic, suddenly became a target. To the others, it was imperfect, provincial, something to be laughed at. It wasn't the first time. They had all heard it before, in classrooms, interviews, even casual conversations. "Your English is good for a Filipino." the phrase that pretends to be praise but cuts like a knife. But this time was different. They hadn't come to prove they could speak English well. They had come to prove that their voice, this very rhythm, this sound shaped by their islands, was worthy of respect. In that moment, under the weight of laughter, something quiet but unbreakable began to form between them. It was not anger, it was resolve. Long before the applause, there were nights of exhaustion, of whispered plans under dim library lights. Carlo, Maria, and Ben had spent weeks preparing, not just memorizing facts or polishing arguments, but building armor against the ridicule they knew would come. The university library in Quezon City became their second home, the air thick with the scent of old paper and determination. Carlo often led the sessions, his voice steady even when fatigue crept in. He carried with him every mocking laugh he had ever heard and turned it into fuel. For him, every insult was a spark. Maria, precise and thoughtful, dreamed of becoming a lawyer one day. She remembered her professor's casual remark that Filipino debaters would never match the eloquence of the West. Each night she rewrote her notes, not just to win, but to prove him wrong. Ben, the quietest of the three, listened more than he spoke. The son of a sailor who spent years away at sea, he knew the sting of isolation. His father's stories of hard work and dignity were the rhythm behind his words. They practiced until dawn, reciting speeches to the hum of ceiling fans, correcting each other gently, arguing fiercely, then laughing when exhaustion blurred their sentences. They didn't just practice delivery, they practiced resilience, because they understood that the challenge ahead was not only intellectual, but personal. They studied the topics, climate change, global equity, economic responsibility, but they knew the real test would come when they opened their mouths. Would the world hear their message or only their accent? That question hung in the air every time they rehearsed, lingering like a shadow. Still, they kept going. Beneath the surface of their exhaustion burned a quiet flame, a belief that their voice, no matter how different, deserved to be heard. The day of the debate arrived with the weight of a storm. Flags from dozens of nations hung along the walls, and the air buzzed with the low murmur of ambition. The team from London, polished and confident, sat across from them, three young men in tailored suits exchanging smirks as if the outcome were already decided. When the topic was announced, who leads the global fight against climate change, the London team seized the floor first. Their words flowed smoothly, eloquent, but detached. The Philippines, one speaker declared, is a victim, not a leader in this battle. The statement hung in the air, sharp and final. Some nodded in agreement. Then Carlo stood. His hands were steady, his gaze calm. A victim? He repeated softly, almost as if testing the word. Then his voice rose, firm and unwavering. When storms stronger than tanks hit our shores, when floods swallow our villages, we do not surrender. We rebuild. That is strength. That is leadership. The hall fell silent. The rhythm of his speech was unmistakably Filipino, measured, melodic, and alive. It carried the cadence of a people who had survived. The same accent they once mocked now held gravity. Maria stepped forward next, her voice trembling only at the beginning. My grandmother lost her home to the rising sea, she said, her eyes searching the judges' faces. Her village is not a statistic, it's a memory, a proof that solutions do not come from arrogance, but from compassion. And then Ben, who had barely spoken a word all morning, rose to his feet. When your hospitals lack nurses, when your ships lack sailors, he said quietly, who do you call? Filipinos. We are not just participants, we are the silent leaders you depend on. Each line struck deeper than the last. The laughter that had once filled the room was gone. What replaced it was a stillness, a recognition, the kind that only comes when truth cuts through pride. One judge leaned forward, his pen forgotten. Another blinked back tears. The London team, once smug, now avoided eye contact. For the first time, the voice of the Philippines was not being heard as a novelty. It was being listened to as truth. By the final round, the hall felt different. The same crowd that had once buzzed with mockery now leaned forward, eager for every word. The shift was almost invisible, but absolute. Respect had replaced ridicule. When Carlo rose for the closing statement, he did not carry the anxious energy of the earlier rounds. He stood with quiet authority, as though every hardship had led him to this exact second. His voice carried across the room, steady and resolute. "We did not come here to imitate," he said. "We came to speak the truth, and truth does not need a perfect accent. It only needs a heart." The silence that followed was electric. Then, as if a current passed through the audience, applause erupted. First hesitant, then unstoppable. It wasn't polite clapping, it was release, it was recognition. The London and Canadian teams, still processing their loss, approached them to shake hands. Their smiles were restrained, but their eyes had changed. They no longer saw competitors from a distant archipelago. They saw equals. When the results were announced, the Philippines was declared the champion. Maria covered her face, overcome by disbelief. Ben exhaled, a long breath he had been holding for years. Carlo simply closed his eyes, letting the roar of the crowd wash over him. But even as the trophies were handed out, it was clear this victory wasn't about medals or rankings. Something far more profound had shifted. The sound that filled the hall wasn't just applause. It was the breaking of a barrier that had stood for generations. Their story was already traveling beyond that stage. Within hours, clips of their speeches spread across social media, translated and shared by Filipinos around the world. In classrooms, teachers replayed their words. In overseas dormitories, workers paused their routines to watch with tears in their eyes. For the first time in a long time, they weren't laughing at the Filipino voice. They were listening to it with pride. The world did not forget what happened that day. The video of their debate, three young voices standing tall against mockery, spread far beyond the contest itself. It was replayed in classrooms across Manila, in cafes in Cebu, and in dormitories across Dubai and Hong Kong, where Filipino workers gathered around small screens, seeing themselves in every word. In homes where parents had once urged their children to sound more American, something shifted. They began to hear beauty in their own rhythm, strength in their own cadence. Teachers spoke about confidence, not correction. Students began practicing speeches without trying to erase the traces of home in their tone. Carlo, Maria, and Ben returned to Quezon City as heroes, but they refused the title. When reporters asked how they felt about defeating the West, Carlo smiled and said, "We didn't defeat anyone, we were just finally heard." That sentence echoed almost as powerfully as the debate itself. Maria later taught young debaters, reminding them that credibility is not borrowed from pronunciation, but earned through truth. Ben volunteered to coach students from rural schools, those who spoke with accents even thicker than his own, telling them that voice is not a barrier, it's identity. The legacy of that moment outlived the competition. Across the Philippines and among its diaspora, people spoke with renewed pride. The laughter that once humiliated them had turned into applause that celebrated them. And so the story came full circle. Three voices once silenced became the sound of awakening. The world, for the first time, did not just hear the Filipino accent, they felt it. Because the voice of the Philippines was never small, never broken, never less. It was simply waiting for the world to listen. Years later, the story of that debate still lingered, not as a memory of competition, but as a reminder of something far greater. The video remained online, watched millions of times, often by people who didn't even understand English fluently, yet still felt every word. It was the emotion, the sincerity, the rhythm that reached them. For many Filipinos abroad, the clip became more than inspiration. It became a mirror. In the quiet corners of airports, kitchens, and ships, they whispered the same words Carlo had once spoken. Truth doesn't need a perfect accent. It only needs a heart. That line became a kind of prayer, an anchor against loneliness and shame. The world had always measured intelligence by fluency, power by diction, authority by tone. But those three students had shattered that illusion. They had shown that clarity comes not from imitation, but from authenticity. Their voices carried the weight of history, the sound of islands that had endured colonization, disaster, and doubt, and still sang. Universities invited them to speak, not just about debate, but about identity. They stood before new audiences and spoke about language as both wound and weapon, laughter and defiance. Each time they reminded the world that speech is not just communication, it is memory, dignity, and truth. And somewhere, in countless classrooms and homes, young Filipinos began to speak without apology. Their accents no longer felt like cracks to be fixed, but like maps of where they came from. In the end, that was the real victory. Not a trophy, not applause, but the quiet courage that spread across a nation. The courage to speak as they are, to believe that their voice, imperfect, melodic, human, is enough. Because what began as a debate ended as something timeless. A movement born not from eloquence, but from honesty. And that honesty, that heart, will keep speaking long after the microphones fall silent.